Good morning and welcome to day 3 of the Canadian Water Summit. We've already had so many incredible, important discussions this week, as Kerry and I were just talking about a little bit, the ones we still have to come today. So before I introduce Kerry, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which Water Canada and Canadian Water and Wastewater Association operate. CWWA is based in Ottawa, which has been the traditional land of Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation that has lived on this territory for millennia. Water Canada's parent company, Actual Media, is based here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now actually home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples as well. It is my great pleasure to kick off our first session of the day, Reconciling a Path Towards Equality in Canada. Internationally, the right to water, recognized by the United Nations, entitles everyone without discrimination to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water. Many Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, live without adequate access to safe water. First Nations face greater barriers in accessing water with respect to quantity, quality, and accessibility. And they also face disproportionately higher numbers of drinking water advisories, which also persist for much longer periods of time. Addressing the water divide requires rethinking our approach. Inherently technical problems require more than just technical interventions. New approaches must lift up community voice and recontextualize typical scientific paradigms as part of a comprehensive approach. To tackle this critical topic is Kerry Black, Canada Research Chair and Advisor on Water for many First Nations organizations, draws attention to the key challenges facing Canada in achieving equality for all and delivering on the promise of safe, clean drinking water. Highlighting examples of activities at the regional and national scale, Dr. Black explores historical and current realities. The key to tackling the problem? Understanding our collective role in reconciliation and decolonization vis-à-vis water. This includes building an inclusive environment, advancing the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, creating space, and making change in our approach to research and design are the ways in which we endeavor to create lasting impact and change. Now, before I hand you over to Dr. Black, I encourage everyone to enter their questions throughout the discussion, as we will try and make room at the end for a little bit of a Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Dr. Black.
Thank you so much, Corinne, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about reconciling a path towards water equality in Canada. And it's a pleasure to be able to share this conversation with you today. I want to start first and foremost by thanking CWWA for acknowledging the land on which CWWA is located. But for myself, in the spirit of respect and trust and reciprocity, I want to acknowledge Mohkinstsis, which is the land adjacent to where the bow and the elbow meet here in the traditional territory of Treaty 7 and the oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Yahi Nakota or the Stoney Nakota, comprising the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and Tsuut'ina Nations. It's also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 and the historic Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, I want to acknowledge this as a non-Indigenous person in this space. As I live and work and play within this land, I want to honor and celebrate the territory on which I live, but I'm a visitor too. It's important for me as a non-Indigenous person to acknowledge this sacred gathering place because it provides us an opportunity to engage in and demonstrate leadership on reconciliation. It's a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about today. And so thank you for having me. I want to start first with a story, and I think it's a little bit building on what Charles started yesterday was a story. But I'm going to take you back 20 years and read throughout this brief chat today is a story that goes back often to 2001. I want you to take for a minute that it's February 2001 and it's 9 months after the first reported E. coli case in Walkerton on May 17th, 2000. A community on the southwest shores of the James Bay has had their drinking water system evaluated. System has been acknowledged as being high risk, but there's hope. There's a plan for a new water plant to be completed by the summer of 2001. That same month, another community, an isolated community north of Timmins, Ontario, is deemed also to be at a high risk, at the highest risk level that can be reported. And despite a new water treatment plant that was built only 6 years earlier in 1995, there seemed to be continued strains on the system. There's a berm that diverts wastewater away from the intake pipe for the water treatment plant that has breached. A month later, it's March 2001. It's 10 months after Walkerton, and a community outside of Kenora has had their drinking water system evaluated. The water treatment system was built in 1993 and is considered extremely high risk. At the same time, in that same community, lurking in the background silently, is a poison that's slowly damaging young people, elders in the community. That same month, another community in Northern Ontario is plagued with continued and sustained drinking water advisories. From high THMs to inefficiencies in the operation system, they can't quite seem to shake the drinking water advisories. This is 2001, 20 years ago. Now take pause and consider what happened a year prior to 2001. In May 2000, Canadians' drinking water regulation process and source water protection and basically water management policies and regulations were extremely impacted by the events of Walkerton, and rightly so. It dramatically changed and shifted our approach, especially when in 2002, Justice O'Connor released their report on the crisis of Walkerton that included a targeted chapter that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But I want to go back now. It's 4 years later, it's 2005. And I want to go back to that community, that isolated community north of Timmins. That same community north of Timmins has now been on a boil water advisory for 2 years. So after being reported as high risk, it's on a continued and sustained boil water advisory. 2 years into that boil water advisory in 2005, the community is evacuated. High levels of E. coli are reported in their drinking water, the same E. coli that plagued Walkerton and resulted in fundamental policy changes in our country. It's now plaguing a new community. To combat the E. coli, high doses of chlorine were applied, resulting in pedigo, scabies, and all sorts of skin conditions and other issues, primarily in their younger population and most at risk. At the same time, gastroenteritis issues are reported regularly at the doctor's office. The evacuation separates families, it disconnects them from their home, their land, their place, it pulls children out of school, and it continues to harm their health and well-being. That's when the media begins to start paying attention and stories begin to be shared. That community was Saskatchewan. An elder, William Sutherland at the time, said that a long time ago, his grandfathers had to leave their hunting grounds. He's quoted as saying, "They gave us a piece of land, which is a swamp. My people are tired, my children are tired, my grandkids are tired. They are tired of being kicked around all the time. Remember this, we are people." The solution presented at the time was no more Band-Aid solutions. Media was reporting on a regular basis, but the media attention began to dwindle. Outcry dwindled. And similar to what is currently going on in social media, despite people coming forth and expressing concern over the current state of affairs, this became something that people cared less and less and less about. The issue of First Nations and Northern water access became a normal occurrence. At the time in 2005, in March of 2005, there was 127 reported boil water advisories on the books. And those were just the ones that we knew about. Fast forward to present day, it's 2021, and we're far from addressing those very same issues that I pointed out in 2001. Let's go back to some of those communities. What about the community on the southwest shores of James Bay? Attawapskat First Nation in 2001 identified as high risk, declared a state of emergency over their water in 2019. Another northern community identified as high risk in 2001 had already been on boil water advisories. Niskandiga, as of today, has been on a boil water advisory for 9,626 days. Allow that number to truly and utterly sink in. And what about the community outside of Kenora? And this is the one that was also identified as high risk, but also had something lurking in the background. Grassy Narrows First Nations residents have been exposed to some of the highest levels of toxic mercury for over a half a century. I just want that piece to sink in. In the 1960s and 70s, the Red Reed paper mill, apologies, the Reed paper mill dumped 9,000 kilograms of mercury into the English Wabigoon River, impacting not just Grassy Narrows, but White Dog First Nations and their supplies in the 60s and 70s, 3 generations ago. 90% of the community members exhibit symptoms of mercury poisoning. It was deemed one of Canada's worst environmental disasters. The industrial pollution that impacted those nations is ongoing to present day. But there were recommendations made in the 1980s for remediation. That remediation did not happen. The result, any of you who know what happens when you ingest too much mercury, neurological problems ranging from numbness in fingers and toes to seizures to cognitive delays to psychological stresses. At the time in 2001, a young boy in Grassy Narrows was discovering the world around him. By 2014, that boy had died of mercury poisoning. 2 years later, his sister, Azraya, was found dead in a wooded forest in April 17th, 2016. That is only 5 years ago. Despite compensation that was established with a compensation board in 1985, which was deemed at the time to be rather restrictive and limiting, there has largely been no repercussions, no responsibilities taken, and the issues continue to persist. So what is the issue? Canada is a land of equality, of opportunity, but is it all equal? I don't say all of this to bring you down, but I also know that we're all motivated from Charles's talk yesterday and his keynote, but I also want to remind everyone that while there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, there's also a lot of work to be done. The 2020 Environmental Performance Index, so the EPIs that provide a way of spotting problems, setting targets, tracking trends and understanding outcomes, also helps to identify policies of best practices and is closely related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The EPIs ranked Canada as 24th for sanitation and drinking water and 28th for water resources. In the past 10 years, these numbers have remained relatively unchanged, only worsening slightly, but not improving. So what is the source of these problems? Inequity and inequality for our First Nations and Indigenous communities in Canada. And inequity and equality are words that are used interchangeably, sometimes confused, but they're not interchangeable. Inequity is unfair, avoidable differences arising from things like poor governance, corruption, or cultural exclusion, whereas inequality can often just refer to the uneven distribution of health or resources, as well as other factors that may result in a lack of resources. The state of water and management, water and wastewater management in Canadian First Nations is a result of both of those things, inequities and inequalities. Indigenous communities in Canada face higher rates of overcrowded housing, poor access to drink water, further impacted and exacerbated by inadequate access to healthcare, internet, telecommunications, education. They bear higher rates of disease and rates of unemployment, incarceration, and suicide. These are realities. They're not meant to necessarily bring down the morale, but it's realities of the country that we live in. Let's go back to 2001 though. And this is 6 years after one of the last residential schools closed in Canada. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in particular, especially given where we are at right now in this day and age. It's 10 years after a commitment by then Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, now Indigenous Services Canada, where they committed in 1991 to achieving equality among Canadians, all Canadians, with respect to access to safe drinking water by 2001. 2001 was the date in which they had targeted 10 years to reach equality for drinking water, and we're now 20 years past that date. It's also 1 year after the Walkerton crisis, as I mentioned, in the 2002 report, where Justice O'Connor highlighted, particularly in Ontario, which is where that report was focused, that water provided to many Métis and non-status Indian communities and to First Nations reserves is some of the poorest water quality in the province. It's not provided for people at the standards that generally prevail throughout Ontario. That statement made in 2002. When we look at how things have changed or not changed, we can look to things like the national assessment. In 2001, 75% of systems were deemed at medium or high risk. In 2011, 74% deemed at medium or high risk. So 1991, commitment to equality, 2001, a tremendous amount of medium and high risk systems. 2011, same situation. 2021, uncertain. We don't have an updated number for this. It's 20 years later and we find that not a lot has changed. And I gave you some examples of communities, but let me give you some more. Shoal Lake 40 kilometers west of Kenora, identified as high risk in 2001, still a long-term advisory in place. Northwest Angle 33, identified in 2001 as high risk, had already been on a long-term advisory. The status, still long-term advisory, still in place. Wawasimong, identified in 2001 as high risk. Status today, still persisting. Bearskin Lake, Cat Lake, Sandy Lake, all communities identified in 2001 as being at high risk. All of these communities remain plagued by persisting drinking water advisories. But those are the advisories that we know about. Those are the ones on centralized systems with 5 connections or more. They do not include the majority of communities that access their water through decentralized systems, individual wells. One example is a community that I work with in Treaty 6. In one community, 130 advisories in place on their decentralized systems, so their wells and cisterns, 130 in one community. The tip of the iceberg is what we know about the water crisis in First Nations communities. And so we have a tremendous amount of work to do. And so the innovations and excitement that you took from Charles's keynote yesterday, let's take that and let's channel that towards the First Nations crisis that we're exhibiting. You might sit and say, you think you understand the issues, or you might go, why on earth is this still a problem? We tend to dominate around one-size-fits-all approaches that lack the context of what's actually happening in the communities. We have very slow and sluggish approval processes. One major issue is misguided or outsider priorities that aren't in keeping with what community wants and what community needs. There's lack of community input and involvement throughout the process. There's colonial limiting programs and services that don't necessarily put First Nations interests first and foremost. There's a lack of wraparound supports, training and capacity, chronic underfunding. I want to pause here and say that the current state of affairs has sparked a lot of outcry and support, and that's where we're at right now. Right now, we're in a time of reflection of what happened over almost 2 weeks ago with the discovery of the mass graves at Kamloops Residential School. An important context. And if you don't see the links of what happened in Kamloops and the residential school system to who we are as water and wastewater technicians and providers, then I encourage you to take away from this that there is a very strong and very real connection towards those pieces. Our professions, from engineers to science, from technicians to policymakers, we are involved in persisting the issues of inadequate access to safe water for First Nations and Indigenous communities in Canada. And reconciliation is one step towards that, one way of addressing inequities and inequalities. But it also starts with something more fundamental, which is decolonization. And there are organizations across Canada working at changing the policies, the colonized policies that have dictated water management for First Nations. Those organizations include the Assembly of First Nations, looking at tackling some of the major systemic issues with the way in which we tender projects in First Nations communities, the way in which we tackle water and wastewater holistically or lack thereof, the inability to focus on private and decentralized systems, taking a look at chronic underfunding for what it truly really is, and seeking guidance and approval to fund these projects for the actual cost and not what we think they might cost. First Nations regional organizations are looking to take care and control of water over. They want to address their water issues in their ways, and they want support to do so. They're advocating for changes in policies, from the way in which we fund the projects to the way in which we tender projects, and that change is slowly coming, but it is not necessarily coming fast enough. Decolonization is the key to Indigenous sovereignty, but where does it leave many of us? And I'm going to assume that many of us on the call today are non-Indigenous. Like myself, we have a very clear responsibility, a very clear obligation. The innovations that Charles spoke of yesterday in the water sector, all of that innovation, we can apply that to our work with First Nations, but we have to take pause and recognize that the root issue of water and wastewater management in Indigenous communities in Canada, the path towards equality, the path towards reconciliation with respect to water, doesn't really have anything to do with our ability to provide technical solutions to First Nations. We have a role in reconciliation as community builders, as infrastructure specialists, but it doesn't start by saying, have I got the technology for you? It starts first and foremost by coming to the table reflective, open-minded, and without predetermined solutions. There's excellent examples of meaningful partnerships that have occurred across this country, including the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, that was forged out of extremely strong Indigenous nations who partnered with academia, who partnered with their municipal water providers like Halifax Water to develop an Indigenous-centered approach to their water management. They are just one organization that is working at addressing these issues. It requires strong partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but it requires non-Indigenous peoples to come to the table informed. It requires you to read the TRC calls to action. The TRC calls to action doesn't explicitly call out engineers or researchers or policymakers or municipalities, but it does call us out as individuals to take part in that process. The other piece that is extremely important is the UN Declaration. Weaved throughout the UN Declaration is a strong narrative on Indigenous rights. And if we want to tackle equality of water in Canada for Indigenous people, it requires taking a very strong look at Indigenous rights. This builds on the conversation that you had on Tuesday morning around the Canada Water Agency. The Canada Water Agency gives great potential to Canadians at large with respect to water management. That being said, there remain to be a lot of questions to be answered around the role of Indigenous peoples in that process. Our role is arguably to facilitate those conversations. It's not to drive the process. It's not to push or decide upon what the best solution is. It is to facilitate conversations. It is to advocate. It is to make space. It is to be an ally. It is in that way that we can begin to address the issues of inequity and inequality for water for Indigenous peoples in Canada. Some of the key pieces on your screen there: rights, meaningful engagement, access to resources and funding, roles in decision-making and meaningful roles. So taking away the tokenistic stakeholder approach and allowing Indigenous people to come to the table as rightful rights holders in that decision-making process is critical. It's not about just inviting and just involving. It's about allowing First Nations and Indigenous people to drive the process. That leads to autonomy and the right to self-determination. And it's where we prioritize water for all. As we talk about some of the solutions that need to be faced, I encourage you to think about the last year in particular. So I've given you a snapshot of 2001. Let's take a snapshot of the past year. Indigenous people across Canada face disproportionate rates of disease spread, largely fueled by what we call social determinants of health. It's not just about comorbidities and the state of health for Indigenous people. It is about the structures and infrastructure or lack thereof that contributes to that and exacerbates it further. The number one recommendation: wash your hands for COVID-19. What do you do when you don't have safe, reliable, clean drinking water? If that is your one way of minimizing disease spread. Ask yourself where you fit into this dialogue. If you feel that you don't have a role, pause and ask yourself if that's necessarily true. Look at what's happened over the past week and a half and ask yourself how you can not just stand up, but act. If you know better, you can do better. So start by knowing better. Start by knowing these stories. Start by knowing our real collective history and present with respect to Indigenous water and wastewater management. Ask yourself if you'd be silent 25 years later after a boil water advisory was issued, if your children and grandchildren have never had access to safe drinking water. I want to end here with a quick video. This is B. Muniz from Niskandiga First Nation, and she recorded this video when Niskandiga was evacuated for the second time in 1 year this past November.
Devin Muniz. I'm from Niskandiga First Nation. I miss my house. I miss hanging out with my friends back home because it's a good place. I want them to fix the water so we can go back to our little town. Feel like we don't exist, kind of. that nobody would care because we're suffering to get clean water. Go live there to see how it feels getting no clean water. Get the water fixed.
So I'm going to stop there, and I want to thank you for listening, for paying attention, and hopefully there was, I see now a note that maybe there were some issues in screen sharing, so hopefully that was resolved after that, but if it wasn't, I will endeavor to share those slides so that you can see them. So thank you, Corinne.
No, it looked great, actually. Thank you. And that video is moving for sure. We have a few questions, and we have about 4 minutes or maybe 3.5 minutes to answer a couple of questions here. So I'm going to jump right in. The first question, and bear with me as I read through it, is reconciling with our water. If Canada would consider our water sacred, like in New Zealand, the Maori tribes that live along the, I may say this wrong too, Wanganui River, have declared it as person status. How can we see water as sacred?
Absolutely, and I saw your question on the app last night, Carol, and I appreciate it, and it's good to hear from you. A great question, I think, and something that First Nations across Canada have been advocating for is the recognition of the spirit and beings, not just in terms of who we are as human beings, but the animals and the land, and giving recognition and rightful place to the way in which First Nations worldviews take into account the waters around us. We're a long ways away from New Zealand in terms of being able to do this. If we look at any of our waterways and systems and look at the number of players involved in that watershed, we are a long ways away from that. And it requires those working in the watershed to understand Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and worldviews. It also understands that the motivation you felt around climate change and the discussions we've had throughout this past 2 days around climate change, fundamental to Indigenous ways of knowing and doing is Indigenous science. And that science is climate science. There is no record of any people in this planet with a long-standing relationship of living in harmony with nature than Indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. So we actually don't need to research and figure out Western ways of learning about climate change and water protection. We can actually look to the people that have done it and done it well, have a proven track record in that. So I think it requires coming to the table and recognizing that Western science is limiting. It will only go that far. What we need to do is prioritize Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, and bring that to the table. And I think through that, we might begin to make the steps towards actually recognizing our rivers and waters as being more than just resources. And I think if we were able to come to the table with rights holders and prioritize some of the actions in the UN Declaration, we would begin to tackle the pieces that I think, Carol, you're wanting to see considered in this context.
Perfect. Okay, I think we have time for one quick question. What opportunities in monitoring, maybe through a case study evidence, do you see between Indigenous communities and local authorities?
Yeah, the monitoring piece is a really great point. And there's a lot of nations working individually with either academics, researchers, maybe neighboring municipalities on community-based monitoring initiatives or culturally relevant monitoring initiatives. There's great examples in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, all the way through Ontario, where nations are actually driving the monitoring process and being able to impart not just their historic and cultural knowledge, but being able to drive what the important mechanisms for monitoring are, what are the important pieces to keep in mind, and working in collaboration and in co-development of those monitoring pieces. But I would say it's not something that's enforced at a larger policy level scale. And so if we really want to see those successes, what we need to do is lift up those examples of where communities have come together with their elders, with their knowledge keepers, with their Indigenous knowledge systems, and have developed a community relevant co-developed monitoring platform. And there's lots of great examples of that, but again, it requires lifting them up, but also ensuring that it's something that becomes commonplace rather than the way that it's currently done, which is that Indigenous people are forging those connections on their own and coming up with those processes on their own.
Right. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I know there's a few other questions coming through. I think what I'll do is I'll recommend that we keep this conversation going in the community boards and the discussion forum there on the WOVA platform. Again, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. And I'll hope to see others in the future sessions this afternoon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.